The Gilded Age had left America gleaming on the surface but corroded beneath. In our last episode, we saw waves of immigrants reshaping cities, new inventions soaring skyward, and the hard truth of overcrowded tenements and bitter inequality. The cities had grown tall, but the cracks were growing deeper. And for many Americans, it felt like the country was on the edge of something, either collapse or transformation. This is where the progressives step in. As the 20th century dawned, a new generation of reformers, journalists, activists, politicians, and even presidents began asking bold questions. What should government do in the face of corruption? How can the poorest survive while the richest thrive? Is America really living up to its promise of liberty and justice for all? In this episode, we step into the progressive era, a time when Americans tried to clean up their politics, protect their workers, educate their children, and expand the meaning of democracy itself. We'll meet the muckrakers who exposed the filth, the reformers who fought to fix it, and the ordinary people who demanded better lives and sometimes paid the price for it. We will also look at the tensions in this movement, how reformers could be both visionary and blind, compassionate and controlling. It's a story of ambition, contradiction, and the birth of a modern American governance. So, welcome back to the US History Understanding This Country. If you find value in this podcast, I'd be grateful if you could follow, rate, or share this with others. That's how this journey keeps growing. Let's begin. With the dazzling new world of consumerism and leisure that defined the turn of the century and sparked the push for reform. The factories were roaring, the railroads were humming. America had stepped confidently into the 20th century, and with it came a new rhythm of life, faster, louder, and more indulgent than ever before. For the first time, large number of Americans, especially in the cities, had something rare: disposable income and free time. Instead of working from dawn to dusk just to survive, some workers now had Saturdays off, steady wages, and a growing appetite for comfort and entertainment. Enter consumerism. Storefronts glittered with advertisements. Department stores like Macy's in the New York and Marshall Fields in Chicago weren't just places to shop. They were palaces of desire. Inside, Americans encountered escalators, perfume counters, electric lighting, and all the trapping of modern consumer age. Catalogs like Sears, Roebuck and Co. brought goods to the rural homes, making the luxuries of urban life feel reachable to everyone. Economy began to pivot around buying, not just making. Brand names like Coca Cola, Kodak, and Campbell's Soup became national icons. And with mass production came mass advertising, billboards, newspaper ads, and jingles that made products part of everyday culture. But it wasn't just shopping. Americans also craved escape. They flooded into vaudeville theaters where slapstick comedy and live music played to packed crowds. They rode Ferris wheels at Coney Island, gasped at daredevils on highways, and flocked to Nickelodeons, the earliest movie theaters, to see silent films that flickered with both fantasy and modern anxiety. Sports too became big business. Baseball, once a casual pastime, now filled stadiums. Names like Ty Cobb and Babe Ruth became heroes. The Sunday afternoons became sacred not for church, but for games. But all this glitter had a dark undercurrent. While the middle class marveled at phonographs and automobiles, many Americans, especially immigrants, black workers, women, and children, still toiled in sweatshops, laundries, and mines. For every new electric streetlight, there was a tenement window without one. For every circus tent, a factory where the music of machines never stopped. And the rapid changes brought tensions. Was this new American life making people better or just more distracted? Were Americans becoming more freer or more manipulated by ads and media? Thinking again about this, the very question is still valid after 120 years, isn't it? These questions, these questions helped spark progressive movement as critics began to argue that unchecked capitalism and rapid change were eroding the moral and civic health of the country. The glittering age of consumption had arrived, but soon the nation would take a hard look behind the curtain, and what it found would launch a reform revolution. It has been 30 episodes in this season where we talk nothing but US history. If one theme reappears in a regular interval, that is a revolution in some sort. And I think that is how we evolve as a civilization, no matter where we are on the earth. Now, back to the topic. If you stood on a rooftop in New York or Chicago in 1890s, you might believe you were witnessing the greatest country on earth rising before your eyes. Steel bridges spanned mighty rivers, skyscrapers reached skyward, banks gleamed, railroads conquered distances, and stock tickers buzzed with energy. But look a little closer, and you would see that the shine was just a surface layer. Underneath, it was a system corroded by greed, inequality, and rampant corruption. That's why author Mark Twain called it the Gilded Age, not the Golden Age. The word gilded means covered in a thin layer of gold, but hiding something much cheaper, maybe even rotten underneath. City governments were often controlled by political machineries, tight knit networks of politicians, contractors, and ward bosses who traded jobs, favors, and even bags of cash for votes. The most infamous of them all, Tammany Hall in New York City, led by men like Boss Tweed, who stole millions from the public treasury while presenting themselves as champions for poor. Business and politics became deeply entangled. Corporations gave campaign money to politicians in exchange for sweetheart contracts and no bid deals. Railroads bribed judges. Senators took gifts from oil and steel companies. The wealthy few, often called captains of industry or robber barons, built private empires while the rest of the country barely scraped by. Even the US Senate was nicknamed the Millionaires Club because so many of its members were handpicked by party bosses or bought their way in. This wasn't just a problem in the cities. Across the nation, Americans began to feel like the system didn't work for them anymore, that it had been hijacked by rich and powerful. People were angry, they were fed up, but they weren't sure what to do. Until a new generation of reformers, the progressive, began to push back. They believed that the government didn't have to be corrupt, that cities didn't have to be filthy, that workers didn't have to suffer while stockholders dined on silver. And they believed that the truth, once exposed, would wake the country up. Their first tool wasn't a hammer or a ballot, it was the pen. At the heart of any great movement for change, there is often someone willing to look where others refuse to and tell the world what they see. In the early 1900s, that job fell to a bold group of journalists and writers who weren't afraid to get their hands dirty. President Theodore Roosevelt, both impressed and irritated by them, nicknamed them muckrakers, borrowing the term from Pilgrim's Progress, where a man rakes through the filth and refuses to look up. But these writers embraced the label. They knew that someone had to rake through the muck because beneath it, America was hiding truth too dangerous to ignore. Take Ida Tarbell, for example. Her father had been crushed by the business practices of Standard Oil, the powerful monopoly led by John D. Rockefeller. Tarbell took on Oil Giant with a series of investigative articles that exposed how Rockefeller crushed competitors, manipulated railroads, and controlled the government with his fortune. Her reporting was methodical, fair, and devastating. It helped lay the groundwork for breakup of Standard Oil years later. Then there was Lincoln Stephens. He exposed the web of bribery and water fraud that ran through America's big cities in his book, The Shame of the Cities. He wasn't content just pointing fingers. He wanted citizens to see how they had been lulled into accepting broken systems. His message: you may be victims, but you are also participants. Do better. Jacob Riis was a Danish immigrant. He had a camera and a conscience. He took his lens into the darkest corners of the New York's tenements. His book, How the Other Half Lives, didn't just describe poverty, it showed it. For many middle class Americans, it was the first time they saw what daily life was like for an immigrant poor. No light, no plumbing, no safety. Risk flash photography wasn't just a technical innovation, it was a moral one. And then came Upton Sinclair, whose novel, The Jungle, was meant to expose the exploitation of immigrant workers in Chicago's meatpacking plants. But what shocked the nation wasn't just the human suffering, it was the meat itself. spoiled, diseased, crawling with filth. Public outcry over Sinclair's revelations led directly to the creation of Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, and federal food safety laws. Sinclair famously quipped, I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident, I hit it in the stomach. These muckrakers weren't just writers, they were catalysts. Their work gave voice to the voiceless, exposed the hidden machinery of corruption, and armed everyday Americans with the truth, the first step toward reform. But exposure alone wasn't enough. Change would come only when ordinary citizens, lawmakers, and activists picked up the momentum and turned it into action, which is exactly what the progressives set out to do, reforming politics, schools, workplaces, and even personal behavior. And that's where we are headed next. By the early 1900s, America had seen enough. The corruption, the inequality, the child labor, the unsafe food. It was too much to ignore. The muckrakers had pulled back the curtain. Now it was time to clean the stage. The progressive reformers weren't a single group with one goal. They were a diverse coalition middle class women, union leaders, teachers, ministers, and sometimes even presidents. What united them was the belief that government could and should be used to improve the society, especially where private industries had failed or refused. For decades, American politics had been dominated by party bosses, machine politics, and backroom deals. The progressive wanted to smash that system and bring politics closer to the people. They pushed for secret ballot, so voters couldn't be bullied or bribed. They fought for the initiative and referendum, giving citizens the power to propose and vote on laws directly, not just wait on legislatures. And perhaps most importantly, they supported the 17th Amendment, ratified in 1913, which allowed for direct election of the US senators. Until then, the senators had been chosen by state legislatures, a process riddled with corruption and influence peddling. This change made the Senate more accountable to ordinary people, not just the wealthy elite. Progressives believed that the healthy democracy needed an educated public. Reformers like John Dewey promoted hands on learning and critical thinking instead of rote memorization. Dewey's learning by doing philosophy turned classrooms into laboratories for life. Cities established kindergartens, night schools, and vocational training programs to help immigrants and working class children adjust and advance. Education was seen not just as a personal good, but as a social necessity. For girls, access to public education expanded, though it would take time before equality in curriculum and opportunity caught up. Still, schools became battlegrounds where progressives invested in the nation's future. And then came one of the most controversial reform movements, that was the campaign against alcohol. Many progressives, especially women, saw alcohol as a root cause for domestic violence, poverty, and workplace accidents. Organizations like Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, though it sounds like a radio station, yeah, Women's Christian Temperance Union, and Anti Saloon League mobilized across the country, pushing local governments to restrict or ban alcohol sales. The term wet ticket became a political label. If you supported legal alcohol, you were on the wet ticket. If you opposed it, you were dry. This issue split communities, churches, and even political parties. Ultimately, this movement led to the 18th Amendment in 1919, the beginning of prohibition. But we'll see in later episodes, sorry, banning alcohol opened up a new set of problems no one had anticipated. Along with the history, let me present my opinion. Banning a thing never solved any problem. It only opened up an underground economy. That is the history, that is the human psychology. Only way out was and is creating awareness and educating people of the downside. Again, back to the topic. Factories were still dangerous. Children worked long hours, women were paid less than men for the same jobs. Labor reform became one of the progressives' top priorities. Progressives pushed for safety regulations, workers' compensation, and child labor laws. One of the most tragic sparks was the Triangle shirt paste factory fire in 1911, where 146 young women, most of them Jewish and Italian immigrants, died because of the factory doors were locked from outside. The horror of that fire became the turning point. Reforms followed quickly: fire codes, building inspections, and labor protections that saved lives. Some states also introduced minimum wage laws and maximum hour limits, especially for women and children. Labor unions gained strength even as they clashed with powerful business interests. Honestly, this was no small cleanup. Progressives weren't trying to slow down America's growth, they were trying to shape it, to make it fairer, safer, and more humane. Their reforms would not solve every problem, and some came with their own blind spots, but they changed the rules of the game. And they weren't done yet. In the shadows of booming factories and textile mills, you would often find the smallest hands doing the dirtiest works. At the dawn of 20th century, child labor was a brutal reality across the United States. Boys worked in coal mines, crouched in darkness, sorting stones and breathing dust. Girls hunched over sewing machines for 12-hour shifts in garment factories. In the South, kids as young as 6 worked barefoot in cotton mills. On farms, children rose before the sun to plow fields and milk cows. And many never saw the inside of a classroom. The logic behind this: for poor families, every penny mattered. Factory owners claimed children were easier to manage and could do delicate work better than adults. There were no federal laws stopping this yet, but the tide began to turn when activists put a spotlight on the reality. One of the most powerful figures in this movement was Louis Hine, a school teacher turned photographer. Armed with only a camera and quiet determination, Hine snuck into factories and mines and took photos that would shake the conscience of a nation. His images: tired boys slumped over machinery, little girls with missing fingers, infants sleeping next to looms, became impossible to ignore. Hine's work didn't just document injustice, it gave it a face. These very photos became the rallying cry for the National Child Labor Committee (NCLC), formed in 1904. Reformers pushed state by state, demanding age limits, shorter hours, and mandatory school attendance. Eventually, in 1916, Congress passed the Keating-Owen Act, which banned the sale of goods made by children under 14 across state lines. It was a bold move, but short lived. The Supreme Court struck it down in 1918, claiming it was an overreach of federal power. Still, the battle continued. The moral pressure kept mounting. While true federal protection wouldn't come until Fair Labor Standard Act of 1938, the progressive era laid the moral and political groundwork. The fight against child labor was not just about rules, it was about redefining childhood in America. Progressives believed that childhood should be a time for growth and learning, not survival. They saw education not as a privilege but as a right. And that belief that government had a role in protecting the vulnerable would carry into other areas too. As we zoom out of the factory floor to the halls of power, where one president took on the might of corporate America, his name was Theodore Roosevelt, and they called him Trust Buster. In the battle between people and powerful, one unlikely figure emerged swinging. A man who once said he liked to play the game hard. That man was Theodore Roosevelt. And he didn't just bring reform to the White House, he charged through it like a bull moose. By the time Roosevelt took office in 1901, the American economy was dominated by giant corporations, trusts that controlled entire industries like oil, railroad, steel, and sugar. These trusts weren't just rich, they were powerful enough to dictate prices, crush competition, and influence elections. Roosevelt didn't hate big businesses. In fact, he respected capitalism. But he believed that no company, no matter how rich or influential, should be above the law. No company should be above the law. And when he saw trusts using their wealth to exploit workers, kill competition, and rig the rules in their favor, he acted. In 1902, he stunned the nation by going after one of the most powerful trusts in the country, JP Morgan's Northern Securities Company. It had the monopoly on railroads in the Northwest. Roosevelt's administration sued the trust under the Sherman Antitrust Act, a law that had been on the books since 1890 but was rarely enforced. Morgan, confident and used to controlling presidents from behind the scenes, sent a message to Roosevelt: "If we have done something wrong, send your man to see my man, and we will fix it up." Roosevelt replied, "We don't want to fix it up, we want to stop it." The case went to Supreme Court and Roosevelt won. Northern Securities was broken up. And just like that, the era of trustbuster had begun. But Roosevelt didn't stop with corporate monopolies. He pushed for federal regulation of food and drugs after Upton Sinclair's The Jungle horrified readers. In 1906, he signed the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, ensuring that the food wasn't laced with poison, sawdust, or worse. He also strengthened the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate railroad rates and curb the exploitation of farmers and small businesses. And beyond economics, Roosevelt embraced what he called a square deal: the idea that everyone should get a fair shot, whether rich or poor, worker or boss. Of course, Roosevelt wasn't perfect. His record on civil rights was mixed at the best, and many of his reforms didn't go far enough for the most marginalized Americans. But his presidency redefined what it meant for the federal government to protect the public interest. Before Roosevelt, the government often looked the other way. After him, it had a new job description: watchdog, regulator, and when necessary, an enforcer. As the progressive spirit spread from economy to the environment, Roosevelt would again lead the charge, but this time to protect something far older than any trust: America's wilderness. By the dawn of 20th century, much of the pristine forest and untouched land were disappearing, stripped for timber, mined for ore, and sold off to the private developers. Roosevelt again, but this time not as a trust busting president, but as America's first conservationist in chief. Roosevelt believed that the natural resources of United States, its forests, rivers, and wildlife, weren't just commodities to be bought and sold. He saw them as part of the nation's moral inheritance, something to be protected not just for present profit but for future generations. With the help of men like Gifford Pinchot, the country's first chief of the US Forest Services, Roosevelt created a new vision for the land management. Rather than letting private industry take whatever it wanted, the federal government would manage resources, allowing sustainable use but guarding against abuse. During his presidency, Roosevelt protected over 230 million acres of public land. He established 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, and 150 national forests. The Antiquities Act of 1906 gave him and future presidents the power to preserve land with scientific or historical value, leading to the protection of places like the Grand Canyon and the Devil's Tower. Roosevelt famously said, "The nation behaves well if it treats the natural resources as assets which it must turn over to the next generation increased and not impaired in value." But this wasn't just about trees and rocks, it was about a shift in values. For the first time, Americans were seeing nature not just as something to conquer, but as something to preserve and enjoy. The creation of national parks like Yosemite and Yellowstone gave urban Americans, including many immigrants and working families, a chance to experience the wild beauty of their adopted homeland. It was both democratic and patriotic, a reminder that this land belonged to everyone. Yet, even here, there were contradictions. Native people were often displaced from ancestral lands in the name of conservation. Forests were sometimes managed for logging under the banner of preservation. The balance between use and protection would remain a struggle for decades to come. Still, the seeds were planted. Thanks to the progressives, conservation became a national value. And today, when Americans hike in a national park or swim in a protected river, they walk in the shadows of this era. But as progressives worked to protect the land, others were pushing to redefine the people's role in democracy, especially women, who had waiting long enough to be heard. For much of the 19th century, American women were expected to stay in the background, managing the home, raising children, and staying out of politics. But as cities grew and problems piled up, women were already doing the work of reform. running settlement houses, organizing charities, teaching in overcrowded schools, and advocating for temperance and labor laws. So, when progressive era came along, women didn't ask permission, they stepped forward. One of the key arenas for this rising movement was the push for women's suffrage, the right to vote. This wasn't new. Women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony had been fighting for this since 1840s. But during the progressive era, the demand grew louder, bolder, and more organized. Groups like National American Women's Suffrage Association, led by Carrie Chapman Catt, worked state by state to win voting rights. Meanwhile, younger activists like Alice Paul took a more confrontational approach, organizing parades, picketing the White House, and even going to jail for the cause. And it wasn't just about the vote. Women were at the forefront of the reform movements across the board. Jane Addams, co founder of Hull House, helped establish social work as a profession and pushed for housing reform, sanitation, and labor protections. Florence Kelly led the fight for laws limiting working hours for women and children. Margaret Sanger, though controversial, opened the nation's first birth control clinic and laid groundwork for reproductive rights. Progressive women argued that their work in homes, schools, and communities made them uniquely qualified to improve society. If women were expected to care for the nation's moral health, they reasoned, then why shouldn't they have a say in the laws and policies? Their fight paid off. In 1920, just after the progressive era ended, the 19th Amendment was ratified, guaranteed women the right to vote. It was one of the most significant expansions of democracy in American history. Yet, as with many progressive victories, it was incomplete. Many black, native, Asian, and Latina women still faced discrimination, voter suppression, and exclusion from the mainstream suffrage movement. Full equality would remain a long and difficult struggle. Still, the progressive era marked a turning point. Women were no longer content to stand in the wings. They were organizers, voters, reformers, and leaders, ready to shape the nation they had helped build. And while some were fighting for the women's rights, others were tackling a different kind of injustice, discrimination based on race, ethnicity, and class. While white middle class reformers were cleaning up cities, taking on trusts, and passing laws, millions of Americans were still left out of progress. For people of color, immigrants, and working class communities, the progressive era was just not about hope. It was about a hard truth. Discrimination didn't just happen on the streets, it was built into laws, schools, workplaces, and even neighborhoods. And yet, amid the unfairness, movements were forming from within these communities to fight back, organize, and demand respect. In Mexican American communities, especially in the Southwest, people formed mutualistas, mutual aid societies that provided support when no one else would. These grassroots organizations offered everything from burial insurance to legal help to job networks. They threw community dances and helped fund schools. In a time when mainstream institutions excluded them, mutualistas were safety nets and engines of pride, blending cultural preservation with civic engagement. For African Americans, the post Reconstruction world had brought Jim Crow laws, lynchings, and systemic oppression. In this climate, two towering figures emerged with very different strategies. Booker T. Washington, born enslaved, founded Tuskegee Institute and believed that black Americans should focus on education, vocational training, and economic self reliance. His message was prove your worth through your hard work, and rights will follow. But not everyone agreed. W.E.B. Du Bois, the first black man to earn PhD from Harvard, argued that waiting wasn't enough. He believed in immediate civil rights, higher education for the talented 10th, and direct confrontation of racism. In 1909, Du Bois helped found the National Association for Advancement of Colored People, an organization that would become a powerhouse in fighting for civil rights through legal action, protests, and public advocacy. Chinese and Japanese immigrants faced some of the hardest barriers. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was still in full effect, and Japanese immigrants, especially on the West Coast, faced segregation in schools, bans on land ownership, and rising hostility. But these communities built their own institutions, churches, language schools, and civic groups to survive and push back. In the courtrooms and newspapers, they defended their place in America, often in the face of violent nativism. Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe brought with them a tradition of scholarship, activism, and community organization. Many were deeply involved in labor movements, especially in garment factories. They founded Yiddish newspapers, built settlement houses, and established mutual aid groups that combined religious life and political awareness. Out of these communities came powerful voices for justice, like labor organizer Rose Schneiderman, who famously said, "The worker must have bread, but she must have roses too." The progressive era didn't end discrimination, far from it, but it ignited the wave of organizing and self empowerment among marginalized groups that would carry forward into the 20th century. These voices weren't always included in the history textbooks, but they reshaped the definition of what it meant to be American, expanding the fight for liberty and justice beyond the reform clubs and into the soul of the nation. And that's where we wrap up. The progressive era didn't solve every problem, but it dared to believe that changes were possible. In the next episode, we shift our lens from reform to ambition, to a time when the United States began to look outward, flexing its muscle on the world stage. Expansionism, imperialism, war, colonies, and a young nation asking itself, what kind of empire will we become? Until then, if you are enjoying this podcast, I would be grateful if you could follow, rate, and share. Your support helps me keep exploring the corners of this country's past, one story at a time. Catch you next time. Until then, stay curious and keep learning. Thank you.